Let's go Broncos! Just when many fans thought the Broncos offseason was starting to quiet down, a move happened that could be telling us a lot more than people realize. And no, I'm not talking about a blockbuster signing. I'm not talking about a superstar free agent. And I'm not talking about a player who is guaranteed a roster spot. What I'm talking about is something potentially much more interesting. Because sometimes the smallest moves reveal the biggest plans. And right now, there are growing signs that the Broncos may not be finished shaping this roster. In fact, one new addition has already sparked an important question. Is this simply a depth move, or is it the first sign that Denver is preparing for something much bigger? The timing is what makes this story so fascinating. Mandatory minicamp is here. Training camp is getting closer. Critical roster decisions are approaching. And at the same time, one unresolved situation continues hanging over the team, creating uncertainty about what the Broncos may need to do next. That's why this latest development has my attention. Because smart organizations don't wait until they have a problem. They prepare for the possibility of one. They build contingency plans. They create options. And they stay one step ahead. The Broncos have done that before. The question now is whether they're doing it again. Before we dive into all the details, make sure you've already hit the like button if you trust the Broncos front office to keep strengthening this roster. And I want every optimistic Broncos fan watching right now to leave this comment below. Go Broncos! We're building something special. Personally, I think this is one of those stories that many fans might overlook today but could end up remembering months from now. Not because one player suddenly changes everything, but because roster construction is often about preparation. The best organizations are constantly evaluating talent, searching for depth, and making sure they have answers before problems arise. In my opinion, this signing feels less like a reaction and more like a front office that is staying proactive at a very important stage of the offseason. Now let's talk about why the Broncos brought in Hakeem Butler, what his arrival could mean for the roster, and why this move may only be the beginning of a much busier stretch for Denver. Personally, I think this is exactly the type of offseason story that fans should pay attention to. Not because one signing automatically changes the team, but because roster decisions often reveal what an organization is thinking. Sometimes the most important clues about the future come from the smallest moves. And right now, I can't help but wonder if the Broncos are quietly preparing for something much bigger than most people realize. What makes Hakeem Butler such an interesting addition is that he checks several boxes the Broncos clearly value. According to the discussion, Butler brings a unique physical profile. At 6'5" and approximately 240 pounds, he possesses the type of size that immediately stands out. Add in the athletic traits that were highlighted from his college career, and it's easy to understand why Denver wanted to take a closer look. But here's the important thing Broncos fans need to understand. This signing isn't being viewed as an immediate challenge to the established players on the roster. At least not yet. The discussion made it very clear that Butler projects more as a developmental addition, someone who could potentially earn a practice squad role, compete throughout training camp, and perhaps position himself for future opportunities if he performs well enough. And honestly, that's where the story gets interesting. Because the Broncos have shown a willingness to explore talent from different places. The discussion specifically pointed to Butler's success in the UFL, where he became a back-to-back Offensive Player of the Year with the St. Louis Battlehawks. That's not a small accomplishment. Production is production, regardless of where it happens, and Denver clearly saw enough to bring him into the building. What I find particularly fascinating is how Butler's skill set appears to fit some of the characteristics Sean Payton values. The discussion emphasized his size, his contested catch ability, his physical style of play, and the assumption that if the Broncos are evaluating him, they likely believe he can contribute in multiple ways, including aspects of the game that don't always show up in statistics. That's important because roster spots are often earned through versatility. A player who can contribute in multiple situations naturally becomes more valuable, especially when competing for depth roles, especially when trying to survive final roster cuts, especially when every position group is already crowded. But while Butler's arrival is generating conversation, the larger story discussed throughout the report involves something else entirely. The possibility that Denver may not be finished making moves. And that's where Broncos country should really pay attention. Because according to the discussion, this week could be one of the most important weeks of the offseason. Not because of OTAs. Not because of roster predictions. But because mandatory minicamp is here. And mandatory minicamp changes everything. This is where coaches evaluate players together. This is where installations become more important. This is where roster depth starts receiving closer examination. And this is where organizations begin identifying potential weaknesses that still need attention before training camp. That brings us to the situation that continues hovering over the roster. Jonathan Cooper. According to the discussion, uncertainty surrounding Cooper's situation remains one of the biggest unresolved issues facing the team right now. The report repeatedly emphasized that Denver may need to think proactively rather than reactively depending on how events develop moving forward. And honestly, that's a reasonable point. Successful organizations don't wait for problems to become emergencies. They prepare. They create contingency plans. They identify alternatives. And they make sure they aren't caught off guard if circumstances change. That's why the discussion repeatedly connected Butler's signing to the possibility of future roster activity. Not because Butler directly solves that situation, but because his addition may represent a broader willingness from the Broncos to continue exploring available talent and strengthening depth across the roster. Another point that stood out was the reminder that Denver has made meaningful additions during this period of the offseason before. The discussion referenced previous June acquisitions that eventually became important contributors. That's what makes this time of year so fascinating. Some of the players who arrive now are simply camp bodies. Others eventually become important pieces. And nobody knows which category a player belongs to until the process plays out. Personally, my biggest takeaway from all of this is simple. I don't think the Hakeem Butler signing is the headline. I think it's the clue. The clue that the Broncos are actively evaluating the roster. The clue that they remain willing to add competition. And the clue that they may still have additional moves under consideration as minicamp unfolds. Because if the front office believes this team is ready to compete at a high level, they're not going to leave obvious questions unanswered. And that's why I believe Broncos fans should keep watching what happens over the next several days. Because the discussion repeatedly emphasized one idea that continues making more and more sense the deeper you think about it. The Broncos may be entering one of the most important evaluation periods of the entire offseason. Mandatory minicamp is not just another practice. It's not just another opportunity for players to get work in. It's one of the final major checkpoints before training camp arrives. And for the coaching staff, this is where some very important conclusions start getting formed. Think about it. The Broncos now have a much clearer picture of the roster than they did a few months ago. They've seen young players develop. They've evaluated veterans. They've watched competitions begin to take shape. And they have a much better understanding of where the strengths and weaknesses of the team currently exist. That's why I wouldn't be surprised if Denver remains aggressive. Not reckless. Not desperate, but proactive. The exact word that kept coming up throughout the discussion. Because if the Broncos believe they have a roster capable of competing at a high level, then every move matters. Every depth piece matters. Every insurance policy matters. Every veteran addition matters. And honestly, that's what makes the Jonathan Cooper situation so important. Not because anyone knows exactly how things will play out. The reality is that nobody does. But uncertainty forces organizations to prepare. Uncertainty forces front offices to examine alternatives. Uncertainty forces teams to think several steps ahead instead of waiting for a problem to arrive. The discussion highlighted several possible veteran names that could theoretically help if the Broncos decide additional depth is needed. More importantly, though, the broader message was clear. Denver cannot afford to be caught off guard. And history suggests they understand that. One thing I found particularly interesting was the reminder about previous offseason additions. Some of the most valuable roster moves don't happen during the first wave of free agency. They don't happen during the draft.